In Mark chapter 4, Jesus had just taught the parable of the sower to a crowd that had gathered to hear him teach by the sea. And in this short little story, Jesus describes a man going out to sow seed and the different response that followed based on the type of soil that received the seed that was sown. Then in Mark chapter 4 and verse 10, we get a glimpse at the response that Jesus' teaching of this story received. And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven." That's an unusual statement for Jesus to make. But to understand who he is and what it is he came to accomplish, it's important that we wrestle with it. Because that is, in fact, the point of the parables. I'm not sure that we always appreciate that. If you've grown up around church, if you've heard many sermons on the teachings of Jesus or been in many Bible studies of the parables, odds are you might have heard the definition given that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. By that, we mean that it uses something familiar from just everyday life, but makes a larger point about how God's kingdom works. And while that's true, I think sometimes we interpret that to mean that Jesus is telling these stories the way that we think of illustrations, the way that we might draw on some occurrence in everyday life to help get a point across. But Jesus makes clear here in Mark chapter 4 that his use of parables wasn't actually to make it easier to understand. No, Jesus fully realized that by conveying these messages in parables, he was making it harder to understand. And that was deliberate. Jesus wasn't trying to spoon feed the crowds. He saw himself as fulfilling something that Isaiah had prophesied back in Isaiah chapter 6. That's what is being quoted from there when Jesus says that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. At a time when God's people had wandered far from their covenant commitments to him, he sent Isaiah to prophesy, but he understood that that message delivered 700 years before Jesus would walk the earth would ultimately be one of judgment, because the people would continue to choose to sin, to go against what God wanted. And Jesus taught in parables for much the same reason. If your relationship with God was superficial, if your identity with him rested entirely on upbringing and tradition, and you weren't truly seeking him, you would hear Jesus' teaching and think, that's weird, and go about your life as usual. And that sort of life, where you're not actually seeking to be closer to God, where you're not trying to live life the way God intended, that's inevitably going to lead to ruin and destruction as a result of our own failure to care about pleasing the one who created us. But if you were seeking, no matter how rich or poor you were, no matter how well educated or uneducated you were, if you truly wanted to please God, if you saw what Jesus was doing and recognized that God was with him and wanted to wrestle with what he was saying and try to make sense of it, even if it was confusing, if you would go and ask the follow-up questions to try to make sense of it, then you would understand, you would see, you would be turned, and you would be healed. Jesus' parables have that sort of sifting effect. And that is the challenge that he has for us. Jesus invites us to know the secret of what it's like to live the lives we were created for, lives where God reigns. That's what the kingdom of God is about. And as we encounter these even difficult, confusing things that Jesus says, the invitation for us is to come to him and learn that secret, so that we don't just gain some knowledge from what Jesus has to communicate, but so that our hearts be changed, so that we become people who are living lives where every day God reigns.